Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of the Do No Harm in Medicaid Act, which will ensure taxpayer dollars are not funding the evil practice of transgender child mutilation. And I thank my colleagues from Texas and from Kentucky for sponsoring this important bill. As a father of 8 myself, I know we all want our children to grow up healthy, supported, and empowered. Children should not be subjected to a medical system that pushes life-altering medical procedures and hormone treatments that are incredibly harmful. As a family doctor for over 25 years, I took an oath to do no harm and provide my patients of all ages evidence-supported treatment plans. That is why, as a Utah State Senator, I led the way in 2023 by passing Utah's landmark legislation that banned transgender treatments and procedures for minors. As a result, I faced death threats and my house was vandalized by woke activists, as demonstrated to my left. I am not deterred. That is why I'm staunchly committed to getting this right and finding federal solutions, as I did in Utah, that will protect America's children. At the core of the practice of medicine...
You just watched a man in a business suit use the language of genocide on the House floor, and you're supposed to believe this is a medical debate. And listen here, this matters now more than ever, because the Trump administration just announced 2 rules Thursday targeting hospitals that treat transgender children, using Medicare and Medicaid as the lever to effectively ban gender-affirming care. And this isn't abstract theory anymore, this is happening right now as I speak. And when Mike Kennedy stands there, calling evidence-based healthcare evil mutilation, he's deploying a rhetoric that has precise historical antecedents in every moral panic ever weaponized against vulnerable populations. And I need you to understand the bombshell here, because the House just passed a bill on Wednesday that would criminalize providing gender-affirming care for minors, and you need to grasp what that means when we say criminalize. We're talking about up to 10 years in federal prison for doctors who provide health care that is supported by the American Medical Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, every major medical organization in this country. And here's where it gets even more devastating, because the forthcoming hospital rules could make access to pediatric gender-affirming care across the country extremely difficult, if not impossible, and the care is already banned in 27 states, so we're watching a systematic nationwide elimination of healthcare for an entire population of children. And let me be extraordinarily clear about what the research actually shows, because 46% of trans and non-binary youth have seriously considered suicide in the past year, and studies have repeatedly shown that receiving gender-affirming care can slash that rate by as much as 73%. And when I say slash by 73%, I mean youths were 73% less likely to experience suicidality when compared to youths who did not receive gender-affirming interventions. So when Mike Kennedy speaks, he's not protecting children, he's statistically condemning them to psychological torture and death. Watch him perform martyrdom up there, talking about death threats and vandalism as if he's some kind of persecuted hero, when these bans have devastating consequences, including increased anxiety, depression, and in 7 reported instances, suicide attempts. Documented by Human Rights Watch, and the sheer audacity of standing on that floor, invoking the Hippocratic Oath, while advocating for policies that the studies have demonstrated have positive and potentially life-saving impact of gender-affirming medical care for TGD youth, with a prospective study showing treatment with puberty blockers was associated with a decrease in depression and an improvement in general mental health functioning, is the kind of perverse doublespeak that Orwell would recognize immediately, because this is about power, not protection, and the language Kennedy uses matters profoundly when he says evil practice of transgender child mutilation. He's not describing medical care, he's constructing a narrative of monstrosity that justifies state violence against families. And here's another bombshell, because surgery is incredibly rare among transgender youth, with one 2024 study from Harvard University finding that for every 100,000 adolescents between ages 15 and 17, an average of 2.1 teenagers sought gender-affirming surgery, and that average dropped to 0.1 for teens between 13 and 14 years of age, with no cases reported under age 12. So when he conjures images of mass surgical intervention on children, he's lying, he's constructing a fantasy to justify cruelty, and the medical consensus he's pretending doesn't exist absolutely exists, because the American Academy of Pediatrics pushed back strongly, stating these policies and proposals misconstrue the current medical consensus and fail to reflect the realities of pediatric care and the needs of children and families. And we're watching a coordinated assault where GOP operatives spent an astounding $222 million on anti-trans advertising, more than on housing, immigration, and the economy combined, during the 2024 cycle, which tells you this isn't about protecting anyone. This is about manufacturing an enemy to mobilize voters and consolidate power. Kennedy invokes his credentials as a family doctor for 25 years, but the final version of the HHS report listed 9 authors, all of whom have expressed skeptical views of, or have opposed pediatric gender-affirming care, and the initial report did not list authors to help maintain the integrity of the process, which is exactly how you corrupt science when you want predetermined conclusions. And notice how the American Medical Association and American Academy of Pediatrics released a joint statement rejecting characterizations of their approach to gender-affirming care as negligent or ideologically driven, taking particular issue with the false assertion that their members have committed malpractice, claiming these are rooted in politics and partisanship. So who are we supposed to believe, the entire medical establishment, or one Republican congressman with a political axe to grind? And here's where the cruelty becomes policy, because the second rule blocks all Medicaid and Medicare funding for any services at hospitals that provide pediatric gender-affirming care, and because hospitals rely on Medicare, the rule would have a wide-ranging effect, meaning hospitals will be forced to choose between treating trans kids and staying financially viable, which is economic coercion, designed to eliminate care through market mechanisms rather than direct prohibition. And this is the same playbook used against abortion providers for decades, and the truly sinister element here is a federal suicide prevention lifeline specifically for transgender youth was canceled, as were hundreds of millions of dollars in scientific research funding related to LGBTQ health, and the Department of Justice announced subpoenas of some children's hospitals and threatened providers with prosecution. So they're not just banning care, they're eliminating research funding, they're shutting down suicide prevention, they're threatening doctors with federal prosecution. This is comprehensive systematic erasure. Let's talk about what Kennedy calls protecting children, because the frequency of internalizing disorders appears to be impacted by degree of family support with TGD youth, with very supportive parents having greater positive self-esteem and life satisfaction, and decreased frequency of depression and suicide attempts compared to those whose parents were somewhat to not at all supportive. And such findings underscore that many mental health challenges faced by TGD youth are not intrinsic to being transgender, but rather likely reflect lack of societal acceptance, which means the suffering Kennedy claims to want to prevent is actually caused by the stigma and rejection that his rhetoric amplifies, and policies like his institutionalize. And when USTS respondents who received the gender-affirming hormone therapy or surgical care they needed had lower prevalence of past-year suicide attempts than those who had not received care they needed, 5% versus 9%, and respondents who reported their families were supportive had lower prevalence of past-year suicide attempts compared to those with unsupportive families, 6% versus 13%. We see empirically that support saves lives and rejection kills, and Kennedy positions himself on the side of rejection while calling it love, which is precisely the rhetorical move every oppressor throughout history has deployed to justify violence against the vulnerable. And I want you to feel the weight of what anti-trans laws have directly caused an increase in suicide attempts in some states by up to 72%, because that means Kennedy's legislation in Utah has blood on its hands, that families are burying children because of policies he championed, and he has the audacity to claim he's protecting them. The framing of do no harm is particularly grotesque here, because harm is precisely what these policies inflict, and best practice medical care is backed by years of rigorous research and endorsed by the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Medical Association, and other leading health authorities. And these bills not only display a fundamental lack of understanding of transgender children, but also ban access to medical care, often by criminalizing either the doctors or even the parents of transgender youth. So when Kennedy talks about taking an oath to do no harm while advocating criminalization of healthcare providers, he's engaged in a profound act of projection, where the harm he claims to prevent is the harm he's actively causing. And notice the language of woke activists vandalizing his house, as if community response to policies that kill children is equivalent to the state-sanctioned elimination of healthcare. And Equality Utah condemned the vandalism in the absolute strongest terms, saying, as LGBTQ Americans, we know what it is like to be on the receiving end of violence, and it is never acceptable to replicate the violence or threatening tactics we have had to endure. Because even the advocacy groups Kennedy demonizes understand that violence is never the answer, while Kennedy's policies are state violence enacted through legislative process. And here's the thing about his martyrdom narrative: he faced property damage while trans youth faced 39% of LGBTQ young people considered suicide in the past year, including 46% of transgender and non-binary young people, with more than 1 in 10 LGBTQ young people attempting suicide. So the proportionality is obscene, the comparison is offensive, and the self-victimization is a classic authoritarian move to deflect from the actual victims. And you need to understand the federal implications here because in 2025, 1,020 bills are under consideration across the country that would negatively impact trans and gender non-conforming people, and as the targeting of trans people has increasingly moved to the national stage, we went from tracking 0 national bills up to an unprecedented 88 bills at the federal level in 2024, which represents a coordinated nationwide campaign. Republicans see targeting trans rights as a surefire political winner, and are treating their victory as a mandate to further restrict trans people, citing Trump's closing message, "Kamala is for they them, President Trump is for you." So this isn't about medical evidence, this isn't about child welfare, this is nakedly about electoral strategy, about finding a population small enough and vulnerable enough to scapegoat for political gain, and when federal bills show congressional Republicans focused on restricting trans healthcare, and reinforcing traditional gender roles with proposed bills to revoke federal funds from hospitals that provide gender-affirming care, charge doctors who provide that care to minors with felonies, redefine sex under law to exclude trans people, ban trans people from the military. We see this as about comprehensive legal erasure, about using every lever of state power to eliminate recognition of and accommodation for transgender existence, and Kennedy is a foot soldier in that campaign, despite his protestations of compassion. The evidence he claims doesn't exist is overwhelming because recent years have seen a medium-term study up to 6 years and several shorter-term studies that have demonstrated the positive and potentially life-saving impact of gender-affirming medical care for TGD youth. A prospective 2-year study of 70 gender-dysphoric adolescents in the Netherlands observed that treatment with puberty blockers was associated with a decrease in depression and an improvement in general mental health functioning, with none of the 70 patients withdrawing from the study, and all going on to treatment with gender-affirming sex hormones, which suggests that far from being experimental or harmful, these interventions are well tolerated and beneficial. But Kennedy and his colleagues aren't interested in evidence, they're interested in ideology dressed up as concern, and the American Medical Association and American Academy of Pediatrics are among medical associations that have supported evidence-based gender-affirming care, with the AMA saying in 2021 that gender-affirming care is medically necessary evidence-based care that improves the physical and mental health of transgender and gender-diverse people. So when Kennedy positions himself as the reasonable doctor protecting children from a reckless medical establishment, he's inverting reality. He's claiming the fringe position represents mainstream medicine, while actual mainstream medicine is dismissed as ideology. And this is the epistemic crisis of our age, where expertise is subordinated to political expediency, where evidence is discarded in favor of moral panic. Think about what it means that the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services proposed 2 rules to withhold federal funds in connection with gender-affirming care for trans minors, and the most stringent rule would bar facilities that offer this care from receiving any funding from federal Medicare or Medicaid programs, effectively forcing most medical centers to cease providing it, because this is the federal government using its spending power to override medical judgment to substitute political ideology for clinical expertise to place itself between doctors and patients and families. And when the AAP stated these rules are a baseless intrusion into the patient-physician relationship, and that patients, their families, and their physicians, not politicians or government officials, should be the ones to make decisions together about what care is best for them, they're articulating a fundamental principle of medical ethics and patient autonomy that conservatives claim to support until it conflicts with their culture war priorities. And here's another devastating piece, because more than 20 hospitals, including those in liberal cities such as Los Angeles and Boston, have rolled back or ended their gender-affirming care programs for minors and some young adults, even before these rules take effect, which means the chilling effect is already operating, that the threat alone is enough to make institutions abandon vulnerable patients, rather than risk federal funding. Families like the Gonzalez family, with 3 children who are 5th-generation Texans, have moved out of the United States to a country they declined to disclose due to the federal government's actions to restrict access to transition care. So we're watching American families flee their own country, seeking medical asylum abroad, because Republican legislators have made it impossible to access basic health care, and this should be a national scandal. This should be on the front page of every newspaper that American citizens are becoming medical refugees. Kennedy's invocation of protecting children falls apart completely when you examine the outcomes, because recent political attacks aimed at transgender and non-binary youth have not only threatened their access to healthcare support systems and affirming spaces at school, they've also negatively impacted their mental health, with LGBTQ youth who experienced anti-LGBTQ victimization, reporting more than twice the rate of attempting suicide in the past year. So the attacks are the harm, the legislation is the danger, Kennedy is the threat, and the profound irony is TGD youth presenting for gender-affirming medical care at earlier pubertal stages demonstrated better mental health and sense of well-being at baseline compared to older adolescents presenting at later pubertal stages, pointing to the potential benefits of gender-affirming medical treatment earlier in life, which means delay itself is harmful, that forcing kids to wait through policies like Kennedy's causes measurable psychological damage, and this is exactly what these bans accomplish. They trap kids in distress. They force them through unwanted puberty. They inflict the very harm they claim to prevent. Clinicians, patients, and advocates who have spent years providing, receiving, and learning about the care maintain that it's evidence-based and often life-saving. But federal health leaders made repeated comments likening transgender identity to a political war on biology and denying the existence of transgender people, which reveals the actual agenda. This isn't medical. This is ontological. They're trying to legislate certain people out of existence to declare that transgender identity itself is invalid, and therefore any accommodation, including healthcare, is ideological capitulation rather than humane response to documented need. The Do No Harm in Medicaid Act is Orwellian in its naming because these gratuitous proposals are cruel and unconstitutional attacks on the rights of transgender youth and their families, and by attempting to strip away essential healthcare, the administration is weaponizing the federal government to target a vulnerable population for political gain, according to the ACLU, and the proposals would force doctors to choose between their ethical obligations to their patients and the threat of losing federal funding, and would uproot families who have already fled state-level bans, leaving them with nowhere to turn for the care they need to survive and thrive, which is the point. The cruelty is the point. The elimination of options is the point. They want to make it impossible for trans kids to exist comfortably in their own bodies, and when that drives them to despair, to self-harm, to suicide, Kennedy and his colleagues will shrug and say they tried to protect them from the dangerous ideology. When they are the danger, they are the ideology, and their protection is annihilation. And notice the legislation criminalizes care for transgender youth while explicitly endorsing non-consensual surgical procedures on intersex youth and infants, which exposes the hypocrisies completely, because if this were actually about protecting children from irreversible medical interventions, they would oppose surgery on intersex infants who cannot consent. But they don't, because this isn't about consent or children. It's about enforcing gender normativity, about punishing deviation, about using state power to discipline bodies that don't conform. Mike Kennedy stands there as a father of 8, invoking his children as if his experience parenting gives him authority to strip other parents of their rights to make medical decisions for their kids. Politicians should never prohibit parents from doing what is best for their transgender children, because these families often spend years considering how best to support their children, only to have ill-equipped politicians interfere by attempting to criminalize the healthcare that they, children, and their doctors believe is necessary. And this creates an incredibly dangerous precedent, criminalizing care based on ideology and placing Washington politicians between families and their doctors, which is exactly what Kennedy is doing. He's substituting his judgment for that of families who know their children for doctors who have examined patients for the accumulated expertise of pediatric endocrinologists and mental health professionals, and he's doing it while claiming to represent medicine when he represents its opposite. He represents the intrusion of politics into clinical practice, the corruption of expertise by ideology. And when Mike Kennedy voted against Marjorie Taylor Greene's bill in the House, it reveals fascinating fractures because he sponsored the Utah ban, he championed state-level prohibition, but apparently federal criminalization went too far for him, which suggests even he recognizes some limit to how far this persecution should extend, or perhaps he's simply concerned about electoral vulnerability, given that the defection of multiple Republicans shows there could be some level of resistance among some in the party facing tough elections, so his vote against Green might be tactical rather than principled, a recognition that nationwide felony charges for doctors might be politically toxic even as he continues to support state bans that accomplish similar ends through different mechanisms. The historical parallels here are chilling and precise because every minoritized population subjected to medicalized persecution has faced exactly this rhetoric, that the medical establishment is captured by ideology, that common sense must prevail, that the state must protect children from their own families, from corrupted doctors, from themselves, and when the move comes just a day after the House passed a bill criminalizing gender transition treatment, and earlier this year Kennedy released a report attacking gender-affirming care, rejecting the medical consensus, and Trump issued several executive orders that deny the existence of transgender people, we see a multi-front assault, legislative, executive, administrative, using every tool of government power Several state bills aim to strip legal recognition from transgender people entirely, with 10 states passing such legislation or enacting similar policies between 2022 and 2024, with devastating consequences. And in Kansas, Florida, and Texas, transgender individuals are unable to update their driver's licenses, with some states reverting gender marker changes that were made years or decades ago, which means they're not just preventing transition, they're untransitioning people who transitioned years ago. They're reaching backward through time to erase legal recognition. And when you combine that with the healthcare bans, with the bathroom bills, with the sports bans, with the book bans, you get a comprehensive architecture of elimination, where trans people cannot access healthcare, cannot use public facilities, cannot participate in civic life, cannot even have their existence acknowledged in official documents. And if that doesn't constitute an attempt to legislate people out of existence, I don't know what would. And Kennedy is an architect of that system. Despite his soft-spoken doctor demeanor, despite his invocations of compassion, despite his votes against the most extreme federal versions, he built the Utah model that other states are copying. You need to sit with the numbers here, because studies have found that around 40% of transgender adults have attempted suicide in their lifetimes, and 30% of transgender youth have attempted suicide in the past year, which represents a public health catastrophe of extraordinary proportions. And transgender people who need access to gender-affirming care may experience barriers including costs, lack of providers, and state laws. And over 45,000 transgender youth live in states where laws have passed or been proposed to prohibit youth from accessing gender-affirming care. Yet gender-affirming care is associated with reduced prevalence of suicide thoughts and attempts. So we have the problem, we have the solution. And politicians like Kennedy are preventing implementation of that solution, while claiming they're solving the problem, which is perverse. It's backwards, it's deadly. And when being LGBTQ alone does not put a young person at higher risk for suicide, but discrimination, rejection, fear, and harassment that may come with being LGBTQ in an unsupportive environment are what increase the risk. We understand that Kennedy's policies are themselves the risk factor, that his rhetoric creates the unsupportive environment, that legislation banning care constitutes the discrimination that increases suicide risk. So he is causing the harm he claims to prevent, and he knows it, or he should know it, because the evidence is overwhelming, and his willful ignorance in the face of children's deaths is a form of violence, even if it wears a suit and speaks in measured tones on the House floor. The language of mutilation is carefully chosen because it transforms medical care into violence, it makes doctors into attackers, it positions parents who support their children as child abusers. Kennedy said gender-affirming care inflicted lasting physical and psychological damage on young people, stating this is not medicine, this is malpractice. But malpractice has a definition. It means deviation from accepted standards of care, and studies have shown that many treatment options are generally safe, and that care can have a positive impact on mental health, which psychotherapy alone cannot provide. So providing this care isn't malpractice, it's meeting the standard of care and withholding it when indicated. That's the malpractice, that's the deviation, that's the harm, and Kennedy has it exactly backward, which would be merely incompetent if it weren't so calculated, if it weren't serving a broader political project of erasure. And when Kennedy said doctors providing gender-affirming care are endangering lives, and lambasted medical organizations, stating they betrayed their Hippocratic oath claiming so-called gender-affirming care has inflicted lasting damage and is malpractice driven by ideological pursuits, not the well-being of children, he's engaged in projection of extraordinary audacity because he's the one pursuing ideology over evidence, he's the one betraying medical ethics, he's the one endangering lives through policies that restrict access to life-saving care, and the medical organizations he condemns represent the accumulated expertise of tens of thousands of physicians who have dedicated their lives to healing, while he represents a political movement that has spent over $200 million on attack ads. This matters because the stakes couldn't be higher, and in the wake of suicides of transgender people, policies designed to make life unlivable for transgender people bear responsibility, and by making life for trans youth too difficult to bear, the GOP is hell-bent on a genocide by suicide. And I know that word genocide sounds extreme. I know it makes people uncomfortable, but when you systematically target a population for elimination, when you strip them of healthcare, legal recognition, social accommodation, when you create conditions incompatible with their survival, when you do this knowingly, in the face of evidence about suicide rates, what else would you call it? What other term captures the coordinated state-sanctioned effort to make existence impossible for a category of people? And Kennedy's rhetoric about evil and mutilation provides the moral justification for that project. It constructs trans youth as monstrous, as victimized by ideology, as needing to be saved from themselves and their families, which authorizes the state to intervene with force, with prohibition, with criminalization, and the fact that he presents this as compassion, as medicine, as protection makes it more insidious, not less, because it allows people who don't want to think of themselves as cruel to support cruelty, to vote for elimination while believing they're voting for children's welfare. And here's what they're not telling you: because medical providers and transgender advocates have reported increased harassment threats and targeting, and in some jurisdictions, medical institutions have been found to overcomply with healthcare bans, preemptively halting services to reduce risk of prosecution, violence, and harassment, and the executive order is expected to have a similar chilling effect, with institutions feeling compelled to choose between continuing operations or providing gender-affirming care. Which means the enforcement mechanism is terror. It's the threat of prosecution, the fear of violence, the economic coercion, and institutions are abandoning patients not because the care is harmful, but because providing it has been made too dangerous, too costly, too legally fraught, and that means kids who were receiving care are having it withdrawn, not based on medical indication, but based on political pressure. And when you interrupt ongoing treatment for a mental health condition, what do you think happens to those patients when you tell a kid who has been stable on hormones that they can no longer access them because the government has decided their healthcare is criminal? What message does that send about their worth, about their right to exist? And Kennedy knows this, or should know this, and his advocacy for these policies in the face of that knowledge makes him complicit, makes him responsible, makes him guilty of whatever happens to those kids when they lose access to care that was keeping them alive. And his vandalism, his death threats, they are nothing compared to the death sentences his policies impose on children who will not survive the denial of healthcare, who will not make it through forced puberty, who will not outlast the state-sponsored rejection of their identities. The Do No Harm Act does profound harm. That's the truth. That's the reality. That's the empirical, measurable, documented outcome. And Mike Kennedy standing on that floor calling himself a protector, while championing elimination, calling himself a doctor, while opposing medical consensus, calling himself compassionate, while inflicting cruelty, represents everything that is broken in our political system, where expertise is subordinated to ideology, where evidence is dismissed in favor of panic, where the most vulnerable among us are sacrificed for electoral advantage, and the impact has intensified since early 2025, when the Trump administration took a series of executive actions escalating federal attacks on transgender rights. Which means this is accelerating, this is getting worse. This is moving from state laboratories of oppression to federal mandates. And if you care about children, if you care about healthcare, if you care about the relationship between families and doctors and the state, then you need to oppose this with everything you have, because they are coming for trans kids today, and they will come for other vulnerable populations tomorrow. Because the logic of this attack, the methods of this persecution, the rhetoric of protection masking elimination, all of it is transferable. All of it can be deployed against anyone deemed deviant, against any population small enough to scapegoat, and Kennedy is showing them how to do it with a smile, while wearing a white coat, while invoking his own children, and we cannot let that stand. We cannot normalize this. We cannot treat this as just another policy debate, because anti-trans laws caused increases in suicide attempts by up to 72%, and 1 in 4 transgender youth have attempted to take their own life in the last year, which means every day these policies remain in force, more kids die, and their blood is on the hands of every legislator who voted for these bans, every administrator who implemented these rules, every person who stood by and let this happen while telling themselves it was about protecting children, when the only thing being protected is bigotry, dressed up as medicine cruelty, dressed up as care elimination, dressed up as love. And Mike Kennedy is the face of that lie, the architect of that system, the doctor who forgot his oath if he ever believed it, and history will remember what he's done here, even if he wants to forget, even if he frames himself as the victim, even if he never acknowledges the children. His policies killed because they cannot speak for themselves anymore, because they're gone, and he helped make sure of it.